All right, so thank you everyone for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Sarah and I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you all to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many events we're looking forward to this summer is Lisa Wells in conversation with Lydia Millett about Wells's new book, Believers, Making a Life at the End of the World. Next Tuesday, the 27th, is when you can find that event. If you don't already do so, follow us on social media. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Tonight, we are so thrilled to welcome Quinn and Torrey Peters. Quinn is a long-distance hiker and writer. She splits her time between Alaska and the open spaces of the Western United States. She's the author of the book Through Hiking Will Break Your Heart, an adventure on the Pacific Crest Trail. After a childhood marked by neglect, poverty, and periods of homelessness, and raised by a mother who believed herself to be the reincarnation of the Virgin Mary, Quinn moved out on her own. She found a sense of belonging among straight-edge anarchists who taught her how to traverse the country by freight trains, sleep in fields under the stars, and feed herself by foraging in dumpsters. Her new life was one of thrilling adventure and freedom, but still she was haunted by the ghosts of her lonely and traumatic childhood. The Sunset Route is a powerful and brazenly honest adventure memoir set in the unseen corners of the United States, in the Alaskan cold, on trains rattling through forests and deserts, as well as in low-income apartments and crowded punk houses, following a remarkable protagonist who has witnessed more tragedy than she thought she could ever endure, and who must learn to heal her own heart. Ultimately, it is a meditation on the natural world as a spiritual anchor and on the ways that forgiveness can set us free. Joining Quinn in conversation this evening is Torrey Peters. Peters is a writer living in Brooklyn. She's the author of 2 novellas, Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones and The Masker. She also holds an MFA from the University of Iowa and a master's in comparative literature from Dartmouth. Her novel, Detransition Baby, was published earlier this year to wide acclaim. This evening's event will include an audience Q&A, so please use that Q&A button that you can find at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has already typed something in there that you'd like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please consider supporting and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her book from us. A link to buy The Sunset Route along with Torrey's books will be shared in the chat a couple of times during the event tonight, so make sure you take a look. Torrey, what a joy to welcome you both to Powell's virtually here tonight. Thank you for joining us for this event.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I've been waiting like a week or two to get to talk to Carrot. I'm gonna pin Carrot so that I have it. But yeah, so Carrot and I we know a lot of the same people, and I realized that when this event had been planned, that I'd heard of Carrot and heard of Carrot's work, and I had never read it. And then I got a copy of The Sunset Route, and I've been this spring has been a pretty hectic spring for me. I don't think there's been a time when I had just sat down and read a book cover to cover, and it was the first book I'd read in maybe a year where I was just up till 4 a.m. because I was just so deeply in it. It's just so gorgeous, and I'm thrilled that we had people in common, but I would have wanted to talk to Carrot if I had never heard of it, just based on the power of the sentences alone and the story. So I'm thrilled to get to talk to you, and yeah, this is just really exciting for me.
I am really excited too, and I'm so grateful to Powell's for having us. I feel similarly about Torrey's work because I read Detransition Baby a few months ago, and I hadn't read a work of literary fiction that had sucked me in like that in a really long time. And I think I never know what to expect with literary fiction. I don't expect to get sucked in. And that book sucked me in, and I got really excited, and I just felt really engaged in it. And it also really spoke to me in a lot of ways, where I'm at in my life as sort of a queer who's growing older, and different experiences I've had. And so I was really excited to talk to Torrey. So
Yeah,
I'm
this is
also really
amazing.
stoked to be here.
Yeah, and then actually we ended up just like we like called each other to like plan this event, and then we just like ended up talking for like an hour or like more, just to be like, oh, we just like really like talking to each other. So uh I'm glad that we get to now do it like in front of an audience, but I feel like the vibe is still the same, like, oh look, we're just talking. um Maybe we can just start this out like where you know, I had the feeling as I read your book, like that it's like it's been a while that I've read a book that not just I was like, oh, I was in the world, but it like made me want to do something, and it like it made me both nostalgic, and it was like, oh, I wish I was traveling right now. I wish I should go somewhere. I mean, I don't think I wanted to hop a train just because it sounded incredibly uncomfortable, but I wanted some sort of adventure. And then I was thinking about like the different times in my life that I've tried to do these adventures, and I'm curious like how the actual form of the book came together for you, like the ways in which this book was written at the time that you were experiencing it versus the way you put it together afterwards. Could you like maybe tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So so in my early 20s, I wrote zines, and it was sort of before social media. It's crazy to think that not that long ago was before all social media.
Mm-hmm.
But I wrote zines, which I'm sure a lot of the people watching know what zines are, but you basically just print your writing and make it into a little booklet and then try to sell it to people for like $2. Or that's what we did back then. And there were zine symposiums where you would go, and there would be like hundreds of other people with zines, and you would trade zines. And it was this way to self-publish that was pretty labor intensive, and you didn't make any money off of it because usually you sold it for how much it cost to photocopy. And so I was riding a lot of freight trains and also hitchhiking a lot because I like hitchhiked across the country a few times. I hitchhiked to Alaska twice and was just doing all this sort of compulsive traveling in my early 20s. I think, you know, to keep from feeling, to both feel empowered and see the country in this romantic way and have adventure, and also to kind of keep from feeling my feelings, you know, by constant movement. So I would write all the stories in my zine. And so a lot of the stories in the Sunset Route were originally in my zine. And then over the years, I started blogging in 2008, and I was like, oh, this is much easier than making a zine. Like I don't have to pay for printing and anyone can see it. And then so over the years, I rewrote all those stories. So I've been working on the Sunset Route for 14 years, and everything in it has been rewritten so many times in like so many ways. And there were several like really messy, total chaos manuscripts before this one. So I originally wrote those stories, the adventure stories, while they were happening. And then I've just been rewriting them for a really long time. And a lot of stuff didn't make it into the Sunset Route, but anything, you know, just like anything gets repetitive and boring after a while. So it would have been pretty boring if I included every trip I went on. But I like to think the best ones made it in there.
I mean, it reads like the best ones made it in. What about the parts about like about your childhood and about your mom? Were those also zines of the time, or were those written to sort of like put together and like kind of create sort of like associative moments between the trips? Was that for the book, or was that of the zines?
Those were my zines too. When I started writing zines when I was 23, I was writing about my trips, and I started writing about my childhood too, to sort of start to process and come to terms with my relationship with my mother and all the complicated feelings I had and all the grief, and just like also just the stories, just to, you know, put them down on paper and begin to sort through it. And then I wanted to put the two together because I do feel like in my early 20s, I was a young adult, and I was beginning to try to process that grief. And also like, I think growing up, I grew up in one kind of world, and the world I grew up in was this very particular world. And then as an adult, I was able to shift into a different world because I was no longer a child. I had agency, you know, I could work and make money. I could be free. I could make my own choices. And so then I was in this other world that I could make for myself. But the first world never really left. And they're still both here, and they're just layered on top of each other. And in my early 20s, I was beginning to reconcile that and sort of process the fact that there was the shadow that I no longer had to live inside of, but that I would always carry, and just the emotional experience of that. And also I was sort of discovering the world for the first time, because I grew up in this, so my mom's schizophrenic, and when I was a child, she had all these like really elaborate religious delusions. And so even though, you know, at a certain young age, I realized that those weren't real, it was very much her world that I grew up in. So then as an adult, I went out and I was riding freight trains and I was hitchhiking, and I was like, oh, this is the world. Like, this is what's out there. And it's interesting looking back, I wasn't really scared of anything at that age. Or I wasn't scared of the things I think that maybe other people would be afraid of. I was just like, whatever, I'll be fine. And I just kind of did whatever. But I was definitely learning, like, what the world was. And so I wanted to weave those two together.
I mean, for people who haven't read the book, no spoilers. The form is this like really beautiful way where you have sort of trips that you've taken, you know, riding freight trains or hitchhiking or these movements across the country, and it jumps around in time, but it creates this like resonance, like thematically, between moments in the childhood and like what you learn riding trains, and like the sort of development of that sort of thing. And it comes together just so beautifully. And it feels like, I mean, that's why I'm so interested that they started as zines, because it feels so tight, and that the resonances just build so well. But I'm curious about kind of your process of publishing. Like, you and I both come to publishing from not maybe traditional ways. Like, I self-published, and I, you know, did sort of stuff, and a lot of my self-publishing was inspired by zines. But can you talk a little bit about like how you moved from zines to now having like you know, a beautiful hardcover book?
Yeah. Can I ask you a question about the structure of Detransition Baby that I just thought of that relates to this? So when I was making the structure of the Sunset Route, that going back and forth in time felt like so hard for my brain to figure out. Like, I knew I didn't want a conventional linear structure, but doing that, like moving things around and putting the scenes together in a way that wouldn't like just, you know, like take the reader out of the story, felt so hard. And it felt like every day I was doing like this Sunday New York Times crossword puzzle or something. Like, it like physically hurt my brain. And in Detransition Baby, you also move around in time, and you also switch between characters. And so do you feel like, what was your like, how did you decide to do that format, to do that structure? And what was your process in figuring out how to do that also? Because I think you did a really good job.
I mean, that's why I recognized it in yours, because I was like, this is like, you know, like recognizes like, that there's, you know, my way of doing it is I learned this way a long time ago of, I would print out scenes, really tiny print, and then I would paste it on note cards, and I would then color code the note cards thematically. But this is also before like you could have computers doing it. And I would take a cork board, and I would arrange the scenes according to the colors that I'd coded it. And you could see, you know, this area has all the blue, this area has all the like spirally shapes. And I would begin to like get an idea of like how it's flowing by like coding it visually. And then later on, like now with computers, there's ways, you know, it's easier to copy and paste and do that mostly on the computer. But I tend to think of it visually, and the resonances in yours like have that same kind of thing, where it's like, just when it feels like it's too much in one place, you switch times or you switch places, so that I'm always like on guard. How did you come to do it?
Note cards also.
Note cards, yeah.
I guess the answer is just note cards.
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous essay by John McPhee that's how I taught it. How I learned it was the intro to John McPhee's books of journalism, where he was like, just take note cards and color code them, and I, you know, now I sort of that's sort of like an instinctual thing where I have the cork board in my head.
That's cool. Yeah, I tried doing it on the computer in the manuscript and couldn't, it was too big to visualize. So then I finally, because I kept rearranging it different ways and being like, this isn't working. And so then I put every section on a note card and put them on the floor and like walked around and
no, there's something you can see visually, even though it's prose. Like there's something that pops out at you when you can see it all.
Yeah, it's really cool, like that we can find ways to hold something, because I think a book length project is so large, and the fact that there's these ways we can work with it and hold it in our brain is really like fascinating to me.
Did you do that for your first book?
No, so my first book was really easy to structure because it was just blog posts. So it was like day 1, day 2, day 3. So
okay,
it's totally linear. It needed no structure. So that was really straightforward. So it was this book was the first time I played around with anything like that. And I was like, this is so hard.
Yeah. It is. It's like satisfying though.
It's really satisfying. Yeah. So, you asked about the process of making a book from the zines. Or
and I know your story a little bit, that you were, in the book you talk about becoming a writer, but the one thing that's sort of tied into, I think, like a little bit like the punk culture and is that like you didn't, I did get an MFA and then I transitioned and things kind of fell apart. But like you didn't sort of go the MFA route. You came to like being a writer through this like kind of forming your own way. And I think that a lot of people are like, how do I do this? So I don't know, I'm impressed with the way you did it. And so I just kind of want to hear that story.
Oh, thank you. I think I think a lot of people get MFAs because it gives you a container to write in, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Like a way, like you're accountable to somebody, and you have to write and you have support. And so I kind of feel like whatever you can find that can do that for you can work. And I've always had a hard time with school. So I didn't want to get my MFA.
There's some discussion of that in the book, in fact.
Yeah, I didn't want to get my MFA. And so I was like, okay, how can I set up my life to where, because I knew that I had to write a lot in order to get better, because, it's like anything, it's like you have to do it for 100,000 hours, in order to figure out how to do what you want to do. Like if you're like, I want to get good at this aspect of writing, you just have to do it a lot. And so I was like, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. So when I started writing zines, I was like, how can I get myself to write a lot so that I can start to figure out over the years how to do the things I want to do? And I wrote those zines, and that felt good. But the thing that really made a big difference for me is I needed some sort of external accountability. Like I do really well.
Yeah.
I can be really productive under threat of like disappointing someone or like public shame.
Yeah.
Like
it's very motivating.
Yeah. If someone's expecting something from me, that's how I can be productive, or if I'm going to disappoint somebody. And so in 2013, so I started blogging in 2008, and I was just writing about my life or my adventures or whatever, but I stopped writing trains in 2009, and I didn't have that much to write about. And then in 2013, I started long distance hiking. And my first trail was the PCT, which takes 5 months to hike. And I was like, why? I was just so confident, or just, I don't know. I was like a fool, overly confident, kind of foolish. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I was like, I'm going to hike the PCT and write a book about it. So I did a Kickstarter, and it was pretty small. It was for like $3,000. But I had blog readers, and I was like, I'm doing a Kickstarter to write a book about the PCT, which I haven't hiked yet. And the rewards were all copies of the book. And the deadline, when I said I was going to send out copies of the book, was like a year after finishing the PCT. So then I set out to hike the PCT, and I was blogging every day. That was because that was going to be the manuscript for the book. It was going to be based on my blog. So that made this external pressure that I was like, I said I would do this thing. People paid money, and they're waiting now for the book. And so that really helped. And that taught me a lot. Like that really showed me how, if I can create external pressure for myself, which can be hard, it can be hard to find things like that, that I can be productive and I can work on things. And so I blogged every day. And, you know, in my sleeping bag at night, I typed blog posts on my phone when I was exhausted, which is, afterwards I had I think 150,000 words in blog posts. Incredible. And I was like, I just wrote a 150,000 word draft on my phone. Like that was that was crazy. And that made me realize that we're a lot more capable than we think we are.
Yeah.
Like whenever I try to be precious about my writing or be like, oh, I need this or this, I'm like, actually, like we can do it, you know?
Yeah.
And so then I was in this rush to edit and publish that. And at first I was like, I'll try to get a traditional publishing deal, but I couldn't find an agent who was really excited about the work. And so I decided to self-publish. And I'd been researching self-publishing for a few years because a friend of mine had done it and had told me a lot about it. And I'd also published this, like, it was kind of like this earlier piece of the Sunset Route, just like a part of it, a few of the stories as like a novella, as like an experiment to learn about self-publishing. And then I'd taken it down, and it wasn't polished and it wasn't ready. And so I'd learned a lot about self-publishing. And when I couldn't find an agent, I was like, I'll just self-publish. And then I really had to do it because the Kickstarter was late now. It had been more than a year. And I was like, shit. I was like, people are waiting. So then I had friends volunteer to edit, and I hired a friend to design the cover, and I just formatted it myself and published it. It was actually a really great experience. It could have used, I think, another year of editing, but other than that, it was actually a really great experience. So that was my first book. And then the Sunset Route, I'd been working on off and on for a really long time, but was having a hard time just like sitting down and just, because it was like this chaos manuscript that I just had for forever that I kept rewriting, and it was just a mess. And I knew that if I could sell it, that would give me the external pressure to work on it and finish it. And so then I was able to find an agent eventually, and she sold the book to Dial Press in the fall of 2019, I think.
Yeah.
No, spring 20, I don't remember.
I mean,
spring of 2019,
like,
I don't remember.
Publishing's all about, but I mean, the thing that's so cool to me about it, I mean, my particular story is a little bit different than yours in that I started to trying to do publishing in traditional ways, and it was kind of an exposure to a punk scene. In fact, the same punk scene, you know, some of the same people that we both know, where was people being like, actually, you don't need a lot of this like institutional like validation or institutional like stamps of like, this is an okay way to do it, in order to like basically emotionally move people. Like that there's no barrier to emotionally moving people. And so I came from a world where it's like, oh, you need an agent, you need all this stuff. And then it was like, no, like in sort of like just photocopy a zine, give it to people and see how they're moved. That was actually how I ended up getting into like having people read my work, was like, just put it out there. And I kind of love that ethos. And for me, the like getting to see it in the book was something like a little bit like coming home in like, because in your book, like, oh yeah, I know how that feels. I know how those people are like excited about it. So I was wondering if like maybe we could talk a little bit about like what it felt like to be part of the sort of punk scenes of the maybe Pacific Northwest in the aughts, and how it feels to be like, you know, now in our late 30s.
That's a great subject. Yeah, I agree with you. I think the fact that I came of age around punks who were very kind of anti-institution, even though a lot of them had gone to college, people were, you know, it was all about doing things yourself, like learning to sail or riding freight trains or building something or self-publishing, making zines. And the culture, there wasn't a lot of value in institutions. And I think that helped me form this sense of self outside of institutions that, yeah, I'm really grateful for too, where I didn't see institutions as like the one track. And I think that's true more and more with social media, that more and more there is no barrier between creating art and giving your art to people and having people consume your art because of social media and the internet. So I'm really grateful that I sort of came of age in that world. And now I feel, one thing I think about a lot is how queer culture is sort of a youth culture. And as I get older, it's hard to imagine. It's just hard to imagine the future. I feel like there's not a lot of like archetypes or like people that I can look to and be like, I'm going to be like this person when I'm old. Or I feel like there's this idea that people will just kind of assimilate into heteronormativity and disappear or something. And I don't know, maybe that's what we're doing, is we're making these new stories. But yeah, how do you feel about that?
I mean, I think that's it's a scary thing for me. Like, how I'm not like, basically the question is like, as you get, like for me, as I get older, like when are the places to compromise, and how do I make these compromises? Like, and I think that when I was younger, I saw it as a sort of binary between like, you either like completely capitulate or you like uncompromisingly resist, and that like, those are the two options. And now I'm sort of in a place of like, well, how am I gonna make these compromises? How am I gonna navigate it? Especially as I want to do things like, share my writing to multiple audiences, some of whom aren't like queer or punks or are far from queers and punks. And I don't know exactly how I think this year for me is a question of navigating it. But I do know that like, as I got a little older, I was really hungry for a kind of stability that I had when I was much younger and then lost. And then now I'm sort of like, I have this apartment in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and it's like, it's this comfortable place. And it's like, I want to hold on to it forever. And there's a younger version of myself that's like, why would you, that wants to be riding freight trains, that wants to be traveling. And it's like, why are you like so concerned with like your pasta maker or whatever it is that, I'm doing in my domesticity these days. But I'm not totally settled in that. And I have moments where I'm like, maybe I've made the wrong compromises, or that I need to rethink the ways that I compromise.
You also have a cabin in the woods, though, an off-grid cabin in the woods.
That is true. That's my like apocalypse hideout. I have an off-grid, like 100-foot square, like abandoned hunter's cabin that when this doesn't work out, I can run away. I can run away to.
That's so awesome.
Yeah. But that too is like, the idea of having that would have been very shocking to me 10 years ago, like being like, this cabin, I'm going to restore it. It's a 20-year project and I'm going to be in this place for 20 years trying to get it working. Like that level of like longevity. I didn't even think that I would live like, the horizon of what you were doing was 2 months ahead. And that was like a long time. And now the horizon is suddenly like a 20-year horizon. It's a really different way of thinking than when I was younger. And I think different than a lot of like that queer punk scene that I knew, where the horizon of planning was so short.
Yeah, totally. Maybe the question is, how do we grow older and find these different kinds of stability, like investing in a land project where you're visioning like 20 years down the road, and find these things, but also hold on to the magic that came with the way we lived when we were younger, when I always, when I was in my early 20s, I thought, civilization was going to collapse in 5 years. So
there's so many funny lines in this book that are sort of about that, like knowing that this book is, you know, these are scenes that take place in 2003, and you're like, but of course by 2006 it will all have fallen apart. And it's like there's just like beautiful wry humor in that. But anyway, I cut you off.
Yeah, like, yeah, I feel like when you're living that way where you're not planning for the future, things can be really magical, and it creates this vacuum where there's all this possibility. Every moment is all this possibility. And as I grow older, I also want more stability. And but yeah, it's finding the things that feel like stability, but still holding on to that magic. I think that's it. Yeah. Can I ask you, Torrey?
The book does an amazing job with the magic. I just want to say, like, I think that's why I read it and I was like, I want to travel, because it like reminded me of a kind of magic that I don't have as frequently in my life. And it's like, it was amazing the way it happened.
Sometimes I think I have this idea that you can have freedom or you can have security.
Mm-hmm.
And it's we don't always get to have both, which is a bummer, but maybe life is just moving between the two, you know, until we die. And just because I feel like you can really appreciate one from the other too. Like, you can travel for a while and then be so grateful to go home and just like be home. And then you can be home for a while and then traveling becomes really magical. And we're just moving between these things, you know, until we die. And that's embodiment, maybe.
How do you think that relates to, like, I mean, one of the books that's like in your book a lot is Annie Dillard, Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek. And, you know, Annie Dillard wrote this book when she was, what, 25, 26. And it has a sort of magic of foreverness, but also like then knowing Annie Dillard over her entire career, where it wasn't necessarily that way all the time. Like, there's a way in which like Annie Dillard a little bit, I felt, haunts this book. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, definitely. So Pilgrim at Tinker Creek is my favorite book, which I think it's the book is pretty polarizing. And I think one reason I love it so much is when I found it was at this moment in my life when I was really trying to answer these big questions about embodiment and the natural world and these sort of spiritual questions. And I just felt like she was just like tripping, like just in this space, just like tripping out on nature. And it like just really opened my mind in my way, like in a way like I never read anything like that. So it really, I feel like the things we read when we're younger sometimes kind of shape our minds and shape the way we see the world, and the things we stumble upon can really like shape, like the books I read when I was younger that I loved stick with me in a way that they'll be with me forever, in this way that I think books I read now, like maybe I'm too jaded, but I often don't feel quite as affected. And so her book just like kind of blew my mind open at the time. And so I wanted to sort of pay tribute to that and weave it throughout the Sunset Route. And I think it probably does like haunt the story a little bit, because it took me, it also took me a really long time to finish the book, like 6 years or something, because it's really dense and there's not really a plot. And books like that are really hard for me to read. And so I just read it slowly over like 6 years. So all the different parts in the book, I'm still reading Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. I'm still reading Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it really influenced me. Do you have books that you read in your younger life that you feel like shaped your creativity and the way you see like words and also the world?
Yeah, I do. But I had a funny thing of like deciding that I wanted to like I think after I transitioned, I wanted to like get rid of a lot of those books. Like, I went through a couple of years where like I would only read books by women, and I was like, I don't want to read any books by men. And then slowly I sort of returned, because I felt like my voice was shaped by these books by men. And then slowly I wanted to like expunge them. And then slowly I've been like realizing that actually I have good relationships with those men, and that there's a kind of like reparative relationship with like even someone like Fitzgerald, like a real classic like male writer, that I'm like, oh, actually his preoccupations and the ways in which he was uncomfortable in society, those are like those are actually models for the ways that I'm uncomfortable, and just these other, you know, sort of analogous, different but analogous ways, and that way of expressing it came from writers like that. And I feel like I'm actually only discovering that this year, like the ways that when I push those writers out, they buried themselves and are like only now, 10 years after I tried to get rid of them from my psyche, are like starting to like pop up like sprouts again.
I feel like the generation we grew up in was still very much, most of the writers that were seen as, I don't know, this certain kind of way were like white male writers. And so I feel like the same thing, like a lot of my understanding of writing and what was possible and what was out there was like a lot of white male writers. And I think, yeah, there is something reparative in taking that, like what we got from that, and then like us being writers, then what we write, we can take that and make it into something new. Like take those influences and sort of, and they inform the way we write, and then we can kind of run with it. And I think that's kind of cool. And obviously now I feel like there's so many, it's not just like white male writers that are being celebrated, which is awesome. But I feel the same way, like a lot of like Steinbeck, you know, and like Faulkner like did so much for me. And Steinbeck is like a horrible misogynist, you know, but yeah, that's why we get to take we get to take what we've learned and create new work.
I'm gonna look at a few of these questions, and maybe we'll go back to a few of the ones that I had. But there was one, just start to stop. There was one thing I love about your writing is how you write in the form of the present tense. It puts the reader right there along with you on your adventures. Can you share a bit about your process and why you write in the present tense?
That's a great question. I love just like talking about writing right now. It's really fun.
Yeah, this is fun.
I wrote my first book, Through Hiking Will Break Your Heart, in first person present tense. And I like it because it has a sense of urgency, and it also puts the reader right in the story. I learned later that there are a lot of people who are just repulsed by first person present tense, which I didn't know at the time. I didn't know at the time, but apparently some people just have this, which is, I mean, that's understandable. Like if, you know, that's the way you feel, but just have this like visceral, like they hate it. And apparently it used to be pretty uncommon for writers to write in first person present tense, but it's currently a trend. So I think I did it because subconsciously a lot of what I was reading was in first person present tense, and it was so gripping. And I was like, how can I make this gripping? And I was like, oh, I want to write like this author. And so I tried it too, but I guess it is currently a trend, and also some people hate it. And the other thing oh, go ahead.
No, I was also admonished not to write in the first person present tense, and I was like, but it's so good, I'm just going to ignore that. And then I went ahead and did it. But please continue. I cut you off.
I love it. Yeah. I am not one of those people who doesn't like reading first person present tense. I love it. I learned also later that it's limiting in other ways. Like so my first book obviously was just a daily journal. So the structure was super basic. The Sunset Route, when I started playing with structure, it got a little tricky because I was like, how do I move back and forth in time with this tense? And at first I was having the more recent years in present tense and then my childhood in past tense, but it didn't work. And so I changed it all to present tense, which I think worked the best, but it was really hard to try to figure out how to do that. And I also learned there's other limitations. Like when you write in first person present tense, it's really tempting to start every sentence with I, like I stood up, I drank some water, I put my sleeping bag away, I walked around. And so like the sentence you're more limited in the kinds of sentence structure you can do. And so I had to do a lot of editing where I went through and tried to change the sentences from this super repetitive way of talking. How do you feel like, what was your process writing Detransition Baby in first person present tense?
Well, I mean, kind of speaking to what you talked about in the present tense with being a child, like oftentimes it was hard because I knew things that in that particular time frame the character didn't know, right? So like if you're writing, like for you, I was impressed with the way that like when you were writing in the present tense of a child, you can only really know the things that a child knows, like because it's the present tense. But at the same time, you can't exactly write as a child because the reader would get tired of that. And so it's like a lot of it for me was like a voice balance of finding what I could sort of slip into that present tense voice of somebody who may not know as much as the writer knows, while still maintaining that illusion. And it's something that like it is a real limitation, the present tense, but it also like I think it's really useful for creating voice. Like in some ways it's easier to create a voice in the present tense because those limitations like make the voice, I found.
Yeah, I really love it for one reason, because I have a hard time focusing when I'm reading, and when I'm reading something in present tense, it just draws me in this way that I can forget that I'm even reading and I just am in the story. And I love that about it. And a lot of the books that I find, like I love being sucked into a book, and the books that do that the most are often in present tense, which I love. Torrey, I asked on Instagram. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, please.
Oh, I asked on Instagram earlier if people had questions for us, and a couple people wanted to know about our writing processes. Would you be down to share your writing process?
Sure.
Like how you structured your work week, or when you have a large project, like how you get shit done?
Yeah. Well, do you know a lot of times for me, I try to get up in the morning and I try and write for a couple hours. And then after a couple of months, I usually have like a whole bunch of kind of scenes and things. And partly I think we should talk about this is the difference between fiction and nonfiction. I think I write novels differently than I do when I approach something that's nonfiction. But for novels, I'm often like, trying to basically get enough scenes that I can start structuring it into a narrative. Do you know this like terrible screenwriting book, Save the Cat? Do you know that? It's this terrible book.
No.
It was like it's basically like it's like this it's a beat sheet basically for what like a Marvel movie is. Like just like here's the hero has doubts, then here's like everything seems to be going right, and then it falls apart, and then blah blah. So it's like a typical action movie beat sheet. And I'll often like take all of my scenes and compare it to like an action movie beat sheet and basically be like, if this was an action movie, if this was like the dumbest, most like just like straightforward movie possible, what would everything be? And then if from that I can often find a narrative, and then it begins to complicate itself, and then it begins to become mine. So usually it's just writing every morning for a couple of mornings. For a couple of months, then finding the narrative, and then going from there.
I love that. Do you have anything you're working on now? Do you have a novel you're working on?
Well, right now I'm actually working on a screenplay, but
cool.
I'm trying to adapt Detransition Baby as a television show, as a comedy television show, half-hour format. So I'm like learning the screenwriting process, and I'm working on a second novel that is a thriller format. Like maybe if I'm calling it a queer financial thriller, we'll see if that's actually what it ends up being. It's like about like sex work and Wall Street and hustling and like all these things. But yeah, we'll see how it actually turns out. How about you?
That TV show and that thriller both sound really good. I'm glad you're writing more. I'm excited about that. I'm working on I'm trying to write fiction because I feel a little constrained. I've only ever really written creative nonfiction, and I really want to grow as a writer, and I think fiction will allow me to do that a little more. And so I'm working on some speculative fiction, and I don't know what I'm doing, but it's really fun, about this young person who's fleeing this city. Maybe in the near future, global supply chains have collapsed, and the state is running out of resources and they're using the last of their resources to sort of police people in these cities. And so the rural US is a little bit of a free-for-all, but there aren't that many people there because without supply chains, it's really hard to get like basic resources. So the people who do live in the rural US are like, it's just really hard to survive. And this young person wants to flee the city because someone tells her about Nevada and tells her that if she can get to Nevada, there are some people she can live with who have burros and are living in Nevada. And so she steals a bike and starts riding across country to get to Nevada. And she's traveling through all this sort of collapsed world, like all these abandoned towns and burnt suburbs. And it's fun. It's really fun to write.
Do you feel
that's what I'm working on right now?
Do you feel that fiction is freeing you to say things that you maybe couldn't say in nonfiction? Like for me, I switched to fiction because sometimes I wanted to like be bitchy about people I knew or like make composites of my friends. I mean, they all recognize themselves and, you know, it's mostly fine. But like it was almost like I needed to switch to fiction in order to tell the truth about a lot of things. Do you feel that kind of constraint, or does nonfiction just feel like home to you?
Yeah, I definitely feel that way because in nonfiction, you can't really talk honestly about people unless you want to destroy your relationships generally. Yeah. And you also, and you're limited by events that actually took place. Like you have the actual events and then you shape them into a story, but you can't just like make shit up. Yeah. And you can't make composite characters. And I'm really drawn to fiction because I think that's beautiful that you can really tell the truth in fiction. And I want to take people in my life and make them into characters and, you know, combine people to make characters. And I want to put pieces of myself in different situations and have them make like certain choices. Do you feel like writing fiction that's been cathartic for you to be able to take those different people and put them in this world that you made?
I mean, my first book, I have thoughts about, I mean, part of it is also like the politics of it too, you know, like my first book I was writing about like sort of trans women and trans bodies, and it's such a loaded thing. Like, and I have opinions about like trans surgeries and the way that like a lot of that happens. But for instance, like there was a guy, a surgeon who in Chicago for a time who was doing what I thought were like pretty bad surgeries on trans women. And so I made a character who'd had a bad surgery from that guy. And I like named that guy in fiction. Whereas if I had like chosen an actual person and been like, this person got a bad surgery, like that would have been such a betrayal. But it was like the thing that I wanted to say was that like this experience of like going to see that guy, like we all know what's happening and we can't say it because of the politics. And in this like fantastical world, I could name it. But you know, and that was freeing. That was a kind of catharsis. And suddenly I could name the things that would otherwise be too painful. Like I didn't name it out of compassion, but suddenly I could be a little bit more cruel in fiction. Like fiction allowed me access to a crueler version of myself that in some ways was a more honest version of myself. But, you know, I think in your book, you don't pull a lot of, at least to me, it feels like you don't pull a lot of punches. I mean, people who have never been able to write about in either fiction or nonfiction have been my own parents, just because I'm like too scared of what that would feel like. And yet you wrote, you know, basically half of this book is about your relationship with your mother, and it's very unsparing.
Yeah, I think for me, the people in the Sunset Route, each person was a different situation, and I had to kind of go through them one by one, because it's true, like if you speak honestly about someone and it's either nonfiction or yet they recognize themselves, then you risk they might not like it might affect your relationship, or you know, it can just like really hurt them. And so my mother, that one, I know she's never going to read it.
Yeah.
So I think that freed me in a way. I was like, this isn't ever going to affect her in any way. And then my father, I was kind of like, well, fuck him.
Yeah.
You know, because you can write, if you like just don't care, you know, then you can obviously say whatever you want. And also, I would be surprised if he read it. We don't have a relationship, and he doesn't know anything about my life or me really. So I don't know. I would be surprised if he read it. And then the friends in it, I got people's permission. So my friend Tara, who I talk about towards the end, I sent that part to her and I was like, what do you think about this? And she actually had me change a lot because
really? Wow.
Yeah, there was a lot more about her life in the book, and that's not really my story to tell. And she was like, yeah, I can't take this all out. And I was like, yeah, totally.
Do you think you do something similar in fiction, like you know, disguise it, or like is it a story that you want to tell, even if you're not entitled to? That like fiction would be a place for it.
I don't need to tell her story because I think she's going to tell it. I think if she wasn't a writer herself, I'd be like, like you got to tell this story. But she's going to tell her story, so I'm like, okay. But I think with other people in fiction, I would probably just make them unrecognizable, like change a lot of details and switch some things up. There's a few people I'm just going to put in there wholesale, but I don't think they'll ever read the book. Like there's this woman I trimmed weed for once who has just stuck in my head since then as this perfect character. And she's like this beautiful aging hippie with like long silver hair and like blousy clothing, and she carries everything in a basket. And she was like a total sadist, like really cruel. And she had like this terrible reputation for just being like kind of a monster to the people who worked for her. And it was just this crazy juxtaposition because she was like this like beautiful like 60-year-old hippie lady, but like just a monster. And she's actually in the speculative fiction I'm writing right now.
I can't wait to meet her personally. Maybe we can do another question from the Q&A, which I'm also would love to talk about, which is Natasha asks, what's our relationship to the word queer? Do we feel that our personal relationship with the word is different than in writing?
Yeah, how do you feel about that, Torrey?
Well, you know, when you and I talked on the phone, I was really interested because I know your story in terms of gender. I know it a little bit in terms of sexuality, and I get in trouble for the words I use. I'm very happy to use words like transsexual all the time. You know, like that seemed to be like the big question that people ask me about my book is like, how come you say transsexual instead of transgender? And like, I have all sorts of political reasons, but the real reason is that it's a more fun word, transsexual. But you know, I was interested in the way that you took on queerness in this book because there's a lot of the book is not structured as a coming out in any way, and the ways that it elides time sort of frustrates, not in a bad way, but it frustrates sort of a conventional sort of like, I developed myself as a queer person over time. The fact that it's moving back and forth, there's no linear sort of like, I learned about myself and then I ended here as this kind of person. And so I'm curious about whether that was intentional and how you chose to write it that way.
I think that, you know, in retrospect, I'm like, maybe I should have made the book gayer. Like maybe queerness should have been a more central theme. But at the time, maybe you feel the same way because with Detransition Baby, it's written for cis women as well as trans women. And it has these universal, maybe with all writing, the idea is to have these universal, relatable human truths. But I really wanted to write something that anyone could like put themselves in my character's shoes in the book and be in the book. And I think by leaving out a lot about identity and those sorts of struggles, I felt like people could get lost in the character a little more. I also liked the idea of having the queerness not be, because I feel like my gender experience is not very interesting. And so having it be not the focal point of the book felt good, because I was like, it's not like a very interesting part of my life, which maybe, you know, queer people, it probably is really interesting to some people, but I kind of felt like it wasn't that interesting. And so having it just be, oh, this character is queer, but not having that be the focus of the book felt really fun. Queer people doing things, basically.
Sorry, I cut you off.
No, go for it.
Well, I love that in your book, that there was a way in which, like, you know, lots of times for other people, queerness is, or, you know, in my case, transness is like the most interesting thing about me. And the sort of claiming that, like, that actually there's lots of things beyond that sort of queerness that are worth talking about, and that, like, the queerness can sort of be something that spices things up in the book, but so bad word, spices, but it's like it's around the edges, and but that it's not actually what has to structure everything. Like, you're coming to terms with forgiveness around your parents, coming to terms with forgiveness around sort of your past, like that felt like the structure, and that was like the overall narrative rather than queerness. And I personally sort of liked the way that it pushed back against a lot of the expectations, while at the same time, like you said, that this book is like maybe it should have been gayer. There's a way for me that, like, I read it and I was like, this book feels very gay, but the gayness is not like the gayness isn't like sort of in using words that are like this, look how gay I am, or something like, look how gay this is, but instead sort of like in a lens, in a way of looking at the world, in a way of like being with other people, like the ways in which, you know, your narrator was with other people, like that, and the way that they shared things together, and the intimacy of that sharing felt informed by gayness beyond, you know, sexual attraction, even though there was sexual attraction at times. And I really admired that. It actually, to me, felt like a kind of transcendence of it transcended a lot of the expectations, I think, that people put when someone's just like, you're queer, we expect you to do this.
Yeah, I think I really like that, having characters that exist kind of outside of gender, or who aren't gendered, like who aren't aggressively gendered, like characters that, because I feel like then any reader can put themselves in that character's shoes. And for my first book, Through Hiking Will Break Your Heart, I had a few people say, like, I didn't know if this was a man or a woman, you know, until they were like halfway through. They like didn't know the gender of the narrator. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
And I like that, having characters that exist sort of outside of, that aren't aggressively gendered in that way, because I feel like, you know, I feel like that's like younger queers, like that's, they're a lot freer than like I feel like queers were when I was younger. And I feel like that's this awesome direction things are headed, where there are all these things a lot of things are becoming less gendered than they used to be. So I think that's fun to play with.
We've got like 1 minute left. We've got a couple of different requests. We've got a request for you to read from the book. We've got some thoughts about music and poetry, or I know that you had some requests from Instagram. I kind of want to throw the last comment or the last topic up to you. What do you have one that looks good to you?
Well, I like this question saying, Kara and Torrey, there is so much about mothers in both of your works. How do you see the importance of understanding motherhood in relationship to queer lives and relationships? Has writing these books informed your view of mothering or caretaking as it exists in manifold ways in a queer community? Do we have time? Is it just
yeah,
gonna, like,
we can do it. That's not gonna turn off. I don't think they're gonna like give us like vaudeville, pull us off stage. Well, why don't you go first on that? No, okay. I think you should have the last word, so I'll just say it quickly. You know, I think that for me, it's a generational question. Like, I think that that this is that right now there's a lot of ways of mothering that aren't working for mothers that aren't working, for maybe for children, and that for me, my book was a lot about posing a question about what comes next. How do we build families that look different and that have like different, that the burdens aren't maybe as unequal in the ways that they work, and that there can be more help, more support. But I don't, you know, no spoilers, but my book doesn't come down in the end as like this, very prescriptive of like, this is how you should do it. And I didn't prescribe because in the end, I think it's up to our generation to solve. How do you feel about it?
I feel similarly. I think that the last few generations, well, speaking as like a white person and my family, which is white, and seeing my mom and her siblings and how they create family and how they create a sense of home, and then seeing my grandparents and how they create a family and a sense of home, and then knowing their histories. There's a lot of things that evolved around, people immigrating here and colonization and the Great Depression and these different generational practices that were very specific to a time and a place and a certain group of people, and aren't working anymore and don't work in the world we're in right now. And I do think it's like everyone now is trying to figure out, well, what is family? Like, what is mothering? What is home? Like, how do we structure human relationships? How do we structure human groups? And how do we, are we having children? How are we raising children? Like, how, because we don't have a lot to work with and we're sort of starting from scratch. So that's something I think about a lot. And I think in my book, it was a sort of a meditation on family and home and sort of this grief of being in a place where I have so little to work with, and we have to come up with those answers for ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I hope that you and I get to talk in another couple of years with the next books, and that maybe us and our whole generation have moved a little bit further forward on that. But I want to thank you so much for talking to me tonight. This is amazing. And I want to thank everybody for coming. The book is absolutely gorgeous. Start to finish. It feels great. I mean, it's also physically gorgeous. It's a beautiful book, but thank you for talking to me.
Thanks so much, Torrey. I hope we get to talk again soon. Yeah. I just want to talk to you about everything. And thanks to everyone who came and watched us talk. It really means a lot. And buy Torrey's book, because it's also
don't want to interrupt you, Karen. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine.
We could have listened to you for hours. What an amazing conversation, and what a joy to have you both here this evening with us at Powell's. We're so grateful to you and to everyone who tuned in. Thank you to the audience for their amazing questions. As Carrot and Torrey were both just saying, please consider purchasing a copy of Carrot's memoir by visiting us at powells.com. Links are in the chat to this book, as well as Detransition Baby, both of which I have here right now. While you're there on powells.com, please make sure to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events, and we look forward to seeing you at another one of them soon. Carrot, Torrey, thanks again. We are so grateful for that wonderful conversation, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Have a great night.